What if the closest trading partner the United States has ever had just got told, in plain words, on live television, that enough is enough? And what if the answer that came back wasn't quiet diplomacy, but a Canadian Prime Minister using a word no Canadian leader has used about America in living memory? Before we go any further, hit like on this video, drop a comment telling me which side you think blinked first, and subscribe if you want to understand exactly how a nearly finished trade deal blew up in less than 2 days. Let's get into it. For weeks, the story around this trade fight had been quietly turning positive. Officials on both sides were meeting, talking, exchanging drafts. Then, just 2 nights before everything fell apart, the President of the United States told reporters that the two countries had reached an agreement pending only the final paperwork. That single sentence changed everything on the Canadian side of the border almost instantly. Canadian stocks jumped the next morning. The main index climbed by around 1%, led by materials and real estate, with mining companies among the biggest winners. That is not how markets behave when they are unsure. That is how markets behave when they believe a deal is basically locked in. Investors were not hedging anymore. They were celebrating. And that is exactly what makes what happened next so hard to process, because it wasn't true, or at least it wasn't finished. According to Canada's own government, the United States had quietly added new conditions in the final days of talks. Conditions that had nothing to do with simple tariff numbers. These new demands, according to Canada, would have cut back the relief that had been promised for Canadian-made vehicles. They would have limited Canada's freedom to sign trade agreements with any other country in the world, and they would have weakened protections around Canadian language, culture, and national identity. Stop and think about that list for a second. This is no longer a fight over how many cents get added to a bag of steel. This is a fight that touches a country's right to govern itself. Canada's own account of these final terms describes conditions that reach into sovereignty itself, not simply into trade math. The Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney summed it up afterward in 6 blunt words. They asked too much, he said, and offered too little. 6 words, but they capture the entire collapse in a single breath. To really understand why this moment feels so heavy, you have to rewind further than just this week. This entire standoff has roots that go back more than a month, to when the American president first reached for a piece of trade law that had been sitting untouched for almost 100 years. That law gave him the power to impose sweeping tariffs quickly, without the usual lengthy process. And in nearly a century on the books, it had never actually been used to impose tariffs before now. The original deadline for a resolution was set, missed, then pushed back by 3 days after that late-night announcement of a supposed deal. Even with that short extension, negotiators from both countries kept meeting right up until the final afternoon, well after the American president had already told the public. The substance was basically settled. That detail alone tells you something important. Even as leaders spoke confidently in public, the actual text of the agreement was still being fought over in private, right up until the very last hours. So what was Canada actually willing to give up before things fell apart? According to Carney's own account, Canada had offered to drop its remaining retaliatory tariffs on steel, aluminum, and cars in exchange for the United States meaningfully lowering its own tariffs in return. Canada also offered to encourage its provinces to bring American alcohol back onto store shelves, alcohol that has effectively disappeared from many Canadian liquor stores for well over a year now. On the American side, the top trade official, Jameson Greer, confirmed that Washington had been prepared to lower tariffs on steel, cars, and lumber, categories he described as genuinely sensitive for American industry. His framing was straightforward. Canada, he said, had been offered better treatment than any other major exporter selling into the American market, and simply turned it down. Here's what makes this particular breakdown so strange to watch unfold. Both governments are describing almost the exact same sequence of events. They just disagree completely on who is to blame. Carney says the new American demands were unfair, economically damaging, and cast doubt on whether any agreement with Washington could ever really be trusted to hold. And Greer says Canada spent an entire year keeping retaliatory measures in place, including what he called outright bans on some American goods, a clear reference to those same provincial alcohol restrictions, and that Washington had simply run out of patience. We've said enough, Greer told viewers on a Saturday morning television appearance, and so we have taken countermeasures. Our interest, he added, is in protecting American workers and protecting American supply chains. That sentence ended any hope that this deadline might quietly slide the way earlier ones had. Notice the difference in how each man chose to explain himself. Carney reached for big, almost constitutional ideas: sovereignty, cultural protection, the basic reliability of any deal his country might sign. Greer reached for something far more concrete: workers, supply chains, a full year of specific retaliatory actions he could point to by name, Neither approach is wrong exactly, but they tell you who each man was really speaking to in that moment. Carney was speaking to a Canadian public that has spent a year and a half worried about exactly this kind of erosion of independence. Greer was speaking to an American audience that has heard, again and again, that this administration is finally willing to fight for domestic industry, after years of what it sees as one-sided trade arrangements. Both messages hit their targets perfectly. Neither message did anything to bring the two negotiating teams back into the same room. It's worth noticing where Greer chose to say all this. Not a formal briefing, not a written statement from a trade office, a weekend morning talk show built for direct, unfiltered messaging to a specific audience. That choice tells you the administration wanted this framed as a stand on principle, not as a technical dispute over line items in a contract. And that framing matters, because it makes it politically much harder to quietly reverse course later, even if cooler economic heads eventually push both sides back toward the table. Let's talk about that alcohol dispute for a moment, because it keeps surfacing again and again in this fight, and it says something about how personal these grievances have become. Provincial liquor authorities across Canada pulled American products off their shelves last year, directly in response to earlier rounds of tariffs. One of the largest single alcohol buyers on the continent, Ontario's Liquor Board, used to purchase close to $1 billion Canadian worth of American products every single year before that ban began. When the top American trade official names those bans specifically on national television as a central reason his country felt forced to act, it tells you this fight was never purely about abstract percentages on lumber or steel. It was about a visible, symbolic act of retaliation that Washington had been sitting with for over a year. And even in its very last offer, Canada was only willing to encourage provinces to lift those bans, not force them to, because alcohol sales fall under provincial rather than federal control in Canada. Now let's talk numbers, because the scale here matters enormously. Once the deadline passed, 50% tariffs kicked in on more than $20 billion worth of Canadian goods, according to American trade officials, though Canadian reporting puts the fuller affected total closer to $28 billion once every targeted category gets counted. Hundreds of individual products are affected. Plywood, cement, hockey sticks, building materials, liquor, certain clothing categories. And unlike most tariffs imposed earlier in this fight, these apply even to goods that would normally be protected under the long-standing North American trade agreement between the two countries. That detail is what made this threat feel different from the moment it was first floated. For years, compliance with that broader trade agreement has acted like a shield, keeping the overwhelming majority of trade between these two countries moving without added tariffs, regardless of whatever political tension existed at any given moment. The century-old law used to bypass that shield had simply never been used this way before. That is part of why this particular collapse carries more weight than a routine missed deadline. Here's a detail that's easy to miss if you only skim the headlines. Greer didn't stop at explaining why the talks broke down. He said plainly that there are no new talks currently planned with Canada, and he confirmed that if Canada goes ahead with its own retaliation, the United States will respond in kind. That is not a pause in negotiations. That is the top American trade negotiator on national television, closing the door for now and promising to escalate further the moment Canada does exactly what it had already said it would do. And Canada did exactly that. Carney announced his country will match the new American tariffs dollar for dollar, with retaliation set to take effect on September the 8th, deliberately timed for the Tuesday right after Labor Day. Those countermeasures, according to Carney, will target steel, dairy, appliances, farm equipment, pulp and paper, and electronics. That is a noticeably wider list than earlier rounds of Canadian retaliation throughout this entire dispute, touching more corners of the American economy at once. If you've made it this far, you clearly care about how this actually plays out. So go ahead and subscribe now, because the next part of this story is where the real stakes come into focus. Reaction inside Canada moved fast, and it wasn't confined to the federal government in Ottawa. The Premier of Ontario, Canada's most populated province, publicly praised Carney for walking away from the deal, arguing that the terms on the table would have hurt his province's auto, steel, and manufacturing industries directly. He went further, urging the country to use every available tool to push back. That matters because this same Premier has, at various points throughout this long dispute, been one of the loudest voices pushing for a quick resolution rather than more conflict. Having him openly support walking away tells you these final terms were seen as damaging well beyond party lines. Now here is the moment that pushed this story past trade policy and into something much bigger. At a press conference, Carney used language no Canadian Prime Minister has used about the United States in living memory. When you get attacked, he said, you are at war. We got attacked. Sit with that for a second. This is the leader of a country that has spent 80 years treating the United States as its closest ally, its biggest trading partner, and its main security partner, all wrapped into one relationship. Carney didn't call this a disagreement. He didn't call it a rough patch. He called it an attack, and he reached for the language of war to describe his country's response. But here's the twist underneath that moment, and it's worth sitting with. In the very same set of remarks, Carney also called the 50% tariffs a miscalculation. Those two words are doing very different jobs. War is emotional. It's political. It signals how seriously Canada intends to treat this moment. Miscalculation is cooler, more strategic. It suggests the other side simply got their math wrong. Read together, Carney appears to be making two separate arguments at the same time. Emotionally and politically, Canada is framing this as something closer to open conflict than ordinary negotiation. But strategically, he is also suggesting that Washington badly misjudged how this would unfold, that walking away from a nearly completed deal over demands touching Canadian sovereignty was a mistake the United States will eventually regret, not a sign of strength. Think about what that word miscalculation actually implies. It suggests the American side ran its own cost and benefit analysis and got the answer wrong. That pushing harder in these final days was supposed to squeeze more concessions out of Canada. Instead, cost Washington an agreement that would have delivered real relief on steel, autos, and lumber tariffs it had itself described as painful. If Carney's reading holds up, the American side traded a workable deal, one the president himself had called very fair only days earlier, for a tougher stance that instead produced a public breakdown, a promise of matching retaliation, and a Canadian leader now describing the relationship using the language of war on national television. Now let's look at how markets have actually responded, because the reaction has been more layered than either a collapsed deal or war rhetoric might suggest on its own. Heading into the deadline, the Canadian dollar was trading near $1.39 against the American dollar. Currency analysts had described the outcome as a genuine fork in the road. A durable agreement could have pushed the currency stronger, while renewed conflict risked pushing it weaker still. Friday's collapse landed squarely on the weaker side of that split, and trading desks are expected to adjust positioning once markets fully reopen. Some analysts had already warned, even before the collapse, that markets remained doubtful any agreement would hold for the long term, pointing to the American president's repeated criticism of the broader continental trade framework as an ongoing source of uncertainty, no matter what got signed in any single week, because American stock markets were closed for the weekend when this all unfolded. The real first test of investor sentiment doesn't arrive until markets open again, when traders finally get to price in the odds of a longer, more sustained conflict, rather than the quick resolution everyone had been expecting just days before. It's worth remembering how muted the reaction actually was just days earlier, when the 3-day pause was first announced. The Canadian dollar barely moved at the time, holding roughly steady as analysts described the market as simply waiting for more clarity before committing to any bigger move. That calm now looks almost quaint, given where things stand after the weekend's collapse. It's a reminder that currency markets, much like the negotiators themselves, spent this entire stretch genuinely unsure which direction things were heading, right up until the moment the deal actually fell apart. Here's where this story reaches past stock tickers and currency charts and into something more physical. Rolled steel, sitting in a storage yard at a major plant in Hamilton, Ontario, has become something of a visual symbol for this entire collapse. Steel that was produced under the assumption of a stabilizing trade relationship is now sitting there with 50% tariffs suddenly attached to it. One business voice captured the practical reality of this over the weekend, describing a tariff of that size as simply not something any business can absorb or sustain. That's not political spin. That's someone who has to price goods and meet payroll under whatever tariff rate happens to apply on any given morning. Now let's zoom out to the bigger picture sitting underneath this entire 18-month standoff. Because Carney addressed that too. He said the breakdown was certainly not welcome news for the much larger review of the Continental Trade Agreement covering the United States, Canada, and Mexico, the treaty that industries across all three countries depend on for predictable, tariff-free trade. That review was already complicated earlier this summer when Washington chose not to automatically renew the agreement under its own built-in checkpoint provisions. A collapsed side dispute over roughly $28 billion in tariffs doesn't just fail on its own narrow terms. It makes trust in that much bigger, much more consequential renegotiation considerably harder to rebuild. To understand the real scale of what's at stake here, it helps to remember just how deeply tied these two economies actually are. Canada remains the top export destination for dozens of individual American states, and hundreds of millions of dollars in goods cross the border between Windsor and Detroit alone on a regular basis, with auto parts in particular moving back and forth across that single crossing multiple times before a finished vehicle ever rolls off an assembly line. A 50% tariff doesn't just tax one crossing, it can effectively tax the very same product several times over, as it moves through a manufacturing process built up across 6 decades of largely open trade. That's exactly the mechanism Ontario's premier was pointing to when he warned about damage to the province's auto, steel, and manufacturing sectors. An integrated supply chain built over generations, suddenly facing a tariff rate designed for a far less connected relationship than the one that has actually existed for decades. Here's why this particular collapse feels different from every earlier close call in this long-running dispute. Multiple deadlines throughout this 18-month fight have come right up to the edge before resolving through last-minute extensions or partial compromises. This is the first time in recent memory that a deal both sides had described publicly as close, with the American president himself saying just days earlier that the two countries had reached an agreement, actually fell apart entirely, instead of getting patched together at the final hour. That's a meaningfully different outcome than anything this negotiation has produced up to this point. And it's exactly why the phrase, "we've said enough," carries so much more weight than it might in an ordinary trade dispute. Based on Greer's own words, no new talks are currently scheduled at all. It's worth sitting with the substance of Greer's specific complaint for a moment, because it reveals what Washington sees as the real driving grievance behind this entire breakdown. He wasn't pointing vaguely at Canadian retaliation in general. He named outright bans on certain American goods and services as his specific example, a direct reference to those provincial alcohol restrictions that have remained in place since last year. That's a telling detail, because it means the American side has spent an entire year treating a provincial retail policy, one the federal Canadian government cannot even unilaterally reverse, as a central justification for a nearly $30 billion tariff response. That mismatch between the scale of the reaction and the scale of the specific grievance behind it is exactly the kind of imbalance that has made this dispute so hard to resolve cleanly at any point over the past year and a half. Before we go further, here's something worth doing right now. If you want to actually understand where this goes next, instead of just reacting to headlines as they land, subscribe and turn on notifications, because the next moves from both governments are going to happen fast, and you don't want to miss them. Let's talk about why Carney chose September the 8th, specifically for his retaliation, because that timing was clearly deliberate. It gives Canada roughly 2.5 weeks between the American tariffs taking effect and its own countermeasures landing. That's a real gap, not an immediate tit-for-tat response. That window does a few things at once. It gives Canadian businesses in the targeted sectors, steel producers, dairy processors, appliance manufacturers, time to prepare, rather than being blindsided the way Canadian goods were when American tariffs landed, with comparatively little warning. It also leaves a narrow door open, whether intentionally or not, for talks to resume, before Canada's own measures actually take effect, even with Greer's declaration that nothing is currently planned. And symbolically, timing the retaliation for the day after a major holiday weekend gives it its own moment in the news cycle, separate from this weekend's collapse, keeping the story alive rather than letting it fade once markets absorb the initial shock. There's also a domestic political layer to all of this worth understanding, because Carney isn't only managing a negotiation with Washington, he's managing expectations at home too, throughout this entire 18-month fight. Canadian dairy farmers, auto workers, and manufacturers have repeatedly pressured Ottawa not to fold under pressure, not to trade away protections for their industries, not to accept any deal that leaves major sectors exposed. Ontario's premier publicly praising the decision to walk away reflects that same pressure playing out in real time. A prime minister who walks away from a nearly finished deal risks criticism for prolonging economic pain if the relationship doesn't eventually stabilize. But a prime minister who accepted terms touching national sovereignty, the freedom to strike, deals with other countries, protections for language and culture, would have risked a far more damaging accusation that Canada gave up its own independence just to make a trade dispute disappear. Given that choice, walking away, however costly in the short term, was very likely the more survivable political decision, even if it wasn't the most comfortable economic one. For American businesses and consumers, the real question now is whether Canada's planned countermeasures, hitting steel, dairy, appliances, farm equipment, pulp and paper, and electronics, end up landing on their own. Supply chains, just as directly as American tariffs, are now landing on Canada's. It's also worth remembering that this collapse doesn't exist in isolation from everything else happening in North American trade policy this year. The broader Continental Trade Review, already complicated by Washington's decision not to automatically renew that treaty earlier this summer, was always going to be difficult, no matter how this narrower $28 billion dispute resolved. What this weekend's breakdown does is make that larger, far more consequential negotiation considerably harder to approach with any real confidence. If a comparatively narrower fight over cars, alcohol, dairy, and a handful of other sectors couldn't survive its final days without collapsing over demands touching sovereignty and cultural protection. It becomes genuinely difficult to imagine the much bigger, far more contentious full renegotiation proceeding smoothly either. Carney's own acknowledgement that this breakdown was not good news for that larger review reflects exactly that concern, spoken by the very person who now has to walk into that bigger negotiation carrying the weight of this weekend's collapse. And that's really the deeper stakes hiding underneath this specific breakdown. It was never truly just about $28 billion in tariffs, or even about steel, dairy, and cars specifically. It was a test of whether these two governments can still reach a lasting agreement at all, at a moment when the treaty framework holding their entire trading relationship together no longer renews itself automatically. And after nearly 2 years of demonstrating, deadline after deadline, just how difficult that basic task has become, this weekend gave the clearest answer yet, and it was not a reassuring one. Here's what we know for certain right now. A deal both governments described as nearly finished just 2 days earlier collapsed less than an hour before the deadline. Carney says Washington's final demands reached beyond tariff rates entirely, touching Canada's ability to negotiate with other countries and protections for language and culture. Greer says Canada's continued retaliation, including provincial alcohol bans, left the United States with no choice but to respond after what he called a year of that behavior. 50% tariffs are now in effect on tens of billions of dollars of Canadian goods. Canada has announced matching retaliation, set to take effect on September the 8th. Carney has chosen the language of war rather than negotiation to describe his country's position, and markets are only just beginning to price in what a prolonged, unresolved trade conflict actually means, rather than the quick resolution everyone was expecting just days ago. There's also a bigger question worth sitting with, one that goes beyond this specific dispute. What happens to trust between these two governments going forward, no matter how quickly new talks eventually get scheduled? Negotiations at this scale depend heavily on both sides believing the other is bargaining in good faith, that a handshake agreement in principle will actually survive the process of becoming signed binding text. In Carney's own words, that Washington's new demands called into question the reliability of any deal at all cut directly at that foundation. If Canadian negotiators walk into whatever comes next, assuming any agreement could be reopened or rewritten at the final hour, that changes how cautiously they commit to anything going forward, which could make future negotiations on this dispute, or the next one, considerably slower and far more adversarial than they might otherwise have been. Think about the everyday people sitting on both sides of this line, because it's easy to lose them in the numbers. A dairy farmer in rural Ontario now has to plan next year's budget without knowing whether the American market will be open, closed, or somewhere in between. An auto worker in Michigan has to wonder whether the parts crossing the border for his next shift will suddenly cost 50% more. A small business owner in either country has to decide right now whether to keep importing at all or whether to quietly start looking for a different supplier somewhere else in the world. Trade wars are often described in billions and percentages, but they are lived day to day by people who never had a seat at either negotiating table. That's part of why this particular breakdown feels heavier than the usual back and forth of trade politics. It isn't just two governments trading blame in front of cameras. It's two economies that have spent 6 decades growing into each other, now being asked to unwind that closeness in a matter of weeks, with almost no warning and very little room to adjust. Whatever happens next, that disruption doesn't reverse itself the moment a new deal gets signed. Supply chains that shift once rarely shift all the way back. This is no longer a story with a tidy resolution. It's a story where a deal that looked essentially finished fell apart over demands that reached well beyond ordinary trade economics, where the top American trade negotiator has publicly closed the door on further talks, at least for now, and where a Canadian Prime Minister has reached for language about this relationship that hasn't been used in generations. For Canadian manufacturers already absorbing real, unmanageable tariff costs on inventory, sitting in yards like the one in Hamilton, the coming weeks will decide how quickly or whether cooler heads on both sides find a path back to a table that was just walked away from. Two countries that have spent 80 years as each other's closest partner are now standing on opposite sides of a line neither one drew alone. One side says it simply said what it had already been saying for a year. The other side says it was attacked. Somewhere between those two sentences is the truth of what just happened, and somewhere in the weeks ahead is the answer to whether this relationship can actually be repaired, or whether this weekend marked the moment it permanently changed. Either way, the numbers are already moving, the tariffs are already in effect, and the countdown to September the 8th has already begun. Stay with this channel, because when the next move comes from either side, you will see it here first.